Today, I will tell you about how the United States of America, known as one of the most powerful nations in the world, actually went through a fascinating and contradictory journey. This is more than just a story buried in the dusty shelves of history. It is the living adventure of a nation that constantly reinvented itself, sometimes achieving the impossible, sometimes contradicting its own goals. This story has far more layers than I expected, each filled with surprising and thought-provoking truths. When we think of the American continent, most of us picture a history that begins with the arrival of Europeans. Yet these lands had been home to humans thousands of years before Christopher Columbus' ships reached its shores in 1492. In fact, this vast continent had an astonishing past stretching back 14,000 years. At that time, much of what is now Canada was covered in thick ice sheets, and where the Bering Strait lies today, there was once a wide land bridge. It was this land bridge that allowed the first people, foreign to the American mainland, to cross into the continent. Here is the surprising part: in 1492, North America was not the untouched wilderness that many imagine. On the contrary, it was a vibrant landscape inhabited by more than 8 million Native Americans. If we could have soared overhead like a hawk during that period, we would have seen far fewer pristine areas than we might expect. Wherever we looked, we would have noticed smoke rising. This is because Native Americans used fire not only for cooking and warmth but also to shape and manage their land. Rivers glittered with log-carved canoes, some carrying as many as 40 to 60 people. Under the moonlight, the silhouettes of migratory birds appeared sharply against the bright disk of the moon. Native American tribes were far from a single uniform culture. They were astonishingly diverse. Some lived in small groups as hunters and gatherers, while others built advanced civilizations with farmlands, statues, temples, cities, and even astronomers they took pride in. In the far west, the Inuit hunted whales with large umiaks covered in walrus skin. In the Pacific Northwest, native peoples repaired salmon traps. In the Sonoran Desert, the Hohokam dug nearly 970 kilometers of canals starting as early as AD 300 to irrigate their crops, a true feat of engineering. However, the most complex civilization of all was the Aztecs, who in 1492 flourished in the Valley of Mexico. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was built on an island in Lake Texcoco and was even more colossal than many European cities of that period. The city was surrounded by canals, merchants traveled thousands of kilometers to bring goods, and it even contained zoos and botanical gardens. With the arrival of Columbus, this reality began to change. Written records started to be kept in North America. Birds flying near San Salvador Island witnessed a sight they had never seen before: 3 large ships gliding across the blue ocean. The strange-looking people inside these astonishing ships must have bewildered the island's natives watching from beneath the trees. From that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. Europe in the 15th century was burning with desire to discover untouched lands. But Europeans were not the only ones venturing across the seas. Under the command of the Chinese Admiral Zheng He, a massive fleet of hundreds of ships crossed the Indian Ocean and reached the shores of East Africa. Compared to Columbus' expedition, just 3 ships and a total crew of about 90 men, Zheng He's 122-meter-long flagship with 9 sails was truly extraordinary. Had the Ming emperors continued supporting these great voyages, the history book we are reading today might very well have been written in Chinese. The Europeans, however, were hungry for glory, fame, power, and wealth. Even if Columbus had not reached the Americas in 1492, it was certain that another European would have done so soon. Columbus saw the small island he reached as a paradise and described the people living there as gentle and friendly. He gave them red caps and glass beads, hoping to befriend and Christianize them. But the fact that he also described them as suitable for governance and labor was an unfortunate sign of what was to come. Columbus' true goal was gold. When he returned to Spain and spoke of precious metals, fertile lands, and peaceful natives, thousands of Spaniards set out with dreams of wealth. On the island of Hispaniola, as Columbus searched for more gold, he began sending Native Americans to Spain to be sold as slaves. He even recorded that each colonist possessed 2 or 3 native servants and hunting dogs. This was essentially a hidden system of slavery. Eventually, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had Columbus arrested and placed in chains. Balboa, like other conquerors, was also in search of gold. The legends the Native Americans told about gold fueled the Spaniards' unending hunger. The tragic part was that despite the Aztecs' tradition of human sacrifice, they had given the world a magnificent civilization composed of poets, craftsmen, and astronomers. Europeans, on the other hand, were reshaping the Americas according to their own desires driven by their greed for gold. This age of exploration meant the collision of two worlds. Columbus had said that the trees in America were as different from those in Europe as night and day. Plants brought from Europe, such as dandelion and bluegrass, became common vegetation of American prairies in our time. Fruits like lemons, oranges, and bananas were also brought from Africa. But even more importantly, American plants were transported to other countries around the world. Today, an Italian cuisine without tomatoes, an Ireland without potatoes, or an Asia without corn has become unimaginable. But the most damaging part of this exchange was microbes. The smallpox virus irresponsibly carried by the African Francisco de Igea turned into a complete disaster for Native Americans. The Native Americans had no immunity to this virus that Europeans had been exposed to and had developed resistance against for centuries. So many people died in Tenochtitlan that sometimes houses were collapsed intentionally so they could serve as tombs for the deceased inside. These epidemics explained how Cortés managed to conquer a city with a population of over 100,000. It is believed that in Central and South America, between 50 and 90 million people died because of these diseases alongside the wars of conquest. In North America, however, the native populations were spread out over larger areas, which prevented the epidemics from advancing at the same speed. Still, not every European came to these lands with bad intentions. Some, like Cabeza de Vaca, even became slaves of Native Americans, learned how to heal them, and dreamed of a world where Spaniards and Native Americans would live together in peace. This was a new and unusual idea, unity emerging from diversity. But unfortunately, his dream was destroyed instantly when Spanish slave hunters found him. Britain could not remain indifferent to the craze for discovering new lands that began in the 15th century in Europe. During the reign of King James I, the first permanent English settlement in the Americas, Jamestown, was founded in 1607. It became a main destination for those who couldn't find what they sought in Europe, people with anxiety about the future, adventurers, and even criminals released from prison. Through various waves of migration, Jamestown grew over time and became a settlement composed of 13 colonies. The fact that these colonies, living far from the troubles of the Old World on safe lands, managed to quickly develop by establishing a democratic system among themselves was remarkable. However, this stable growth led them to rebel against the British Empire to which they were bound. Heavy taxes such as the Townshend Act caused major objections in the colonies. In fact, when a ship full of tea arriving from England was attacked in the Boston harbor and its cargo was dumped into the sea, the event known as the Boston Tea Party effectively ignited the first spark of the Independence War. Life in the colonies varied greatly depending on geography. In the north, the Pilgrims who migrated to New England wanted to form their own independent religious communities. They did not find the Church of England pure enough. These separatists from the town of Scrooby were harassed because of their religious beliefs and had to flee to the Netherlands. But 12 years later, in 1620, they set sail for Virginia aboard the Mayflower with permission to settle. When the ship went off course, they decided to form their own government, and this became known as the Mayflower Compact. Although Pilgrims made up less than half of the passengers, the agreement allowed all free men to have a role in the colonial government. 10 years later, a group of 1,000 settlers led by John Winthrop founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop's famous city upon a hill vision reflected their desire to be a model community that obeyed God's rules. In this colony, church membership determined voting rights. People with different beliefs, such as Roger Williams, were sent elsewhere, and if they insisted on spreading beliefs deemed incorrect, they were even executed. However, Williams argued that the state should not interfere in religious matters, making him one of the first people to lay the groundwork for the idea of religious freedom. In the South, the situation was different. Virginia was rapidly turning into a tobacco kingdom. Although tobacco cultivation was extremely exhausting work, it paid 5 to 10 times more than working on a farm in England. This high earning potential brought thousands of people to Virginia. However, many of these newcomers were indebted servants who signed service contracts to pay off their travel expenses. The high mortality rate caused by malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases on the continent further worsened the situation. Slavery deeply shaped the fate of the South during this period. In the early years of Virginia, there were no laws regarding slavery. Some Africans, like Anthony Johnson, completed their service terms, gained their freedom, and even became slave owners themselves. But in the following century, laws restricting the rights of slaves were enacted. It was ironic that the spread of the ideas of freedom and independence across America coincided with the expansion of the slavery system. This contradiction was one of the most important and complex chapters of American history. The colonies' uprising against Britain led to the convening of the Albany Congress in 1754 and the Continental Congress in 1774. The goal was to form a united front against the British Empire. Their slogan, E pluribus unum, was already ready. This slogan declared that unity is strength. Since the colonies' goal was complete freedom, they needed a cause for war, or a casus belli. Britain's economic hardship despite emerging victorious from the 7 Years' War led it to increase taxes on the colonies. With the implementation of the Townshend Act, the fact that the salaries of governors and judges would be paid directly from taxes collected from the colonies became the final straw. The Boston Tea Party had effectively ignited the first spark of the War of Independence. In 1775, one of the most famous figures in American history, George Washington, took command of the Continental Army. Washington's initial lack of success was due to his lack of military experience. After prolonged conflicts, the 13 colonies decided to seek assistance from other European countries. When this aid did not arrive immediately, they issued the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. This date is today recognized as the official Independence Day of the United States. The Declaration, written by Thomas Jefferson, included the phrase "all men are created equal," a concept that almost no one at the time truly believed. It went beyond defending British rights, asserting that people inherently possessed natural rights. However, despite Jefferson's personal opposition to slavery, his inability to free his own slaves during his lifetime demonstrated how challenging this ideal was to realize. The war contained many interesting details. When Britain's peace offers were rejected, Washington suffered defeat at Long Island, and Manhattan fell under British control. Yet, the colonies persisted with determination. On Christmas night, December 25, Washington crossed the Delaware River, launching a surprise attack on the British at Trenton, followed by victory at Princeton, marking a turning point in the war. This success demonstrated to Americans that Britain was not invincible. However, the Continental Army could still be described, in Washington's words, as a disorganized group. While the British fought and returned home, Washington knew he needed a trained, battle-ready army. The Prussian General von Steuben was called to America to train the army, a twist of fate. Von Steuben quickly instilled discipline, effectively reshaping the American forces. This training played a key role in Washington's success in the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, where British troops were repelled. Foreign support was vital in America's war for independence. France joined the war in 1778, followed by Spain in 1779, and the Netherlands in 1780. France's aid, in particular, was the most crucial factor that significantly shifted the war in America's favor. The last major conflict occurred at Yorktown. British commander Lord Cornwallis, lacking anticipated support, surrendered on October 19, 1781, with an army of 7,000. This siege marked the final significant battle on the continent. After the fighting ceased, intensive diplomatic efforts led to the signing of the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783, granting the United States independence from Britain. The Americans achieved independence through both ideas and struggle. Yet, a question lingered: could they continue to live together harmoniously? After the war, Congress created the official seal of the United States, inscribed with E pluribus unum, meaning out of many, one. But how would they maintain this unity? Initially, a weak central government was established under the Articles of Confederation. Congress had authority to declare war and make treaties, but lacked power to collect taxes, only able to request financial support from the states, and could not regulate interstate trade. These limitations were understandable for a nation that had fought against taxes imposed by a distant parliament. Yet European observers worried that the Confederation might collapse. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention convened to make crucial decisions affecting the nation's future. James Madison's Virginia Plan proposed a strong national government with representation based on population. Smaller states demanded equal votes for each state. The most intense debates concerned the structure of the legislative body. Disagreements between large and small states, as well as between northern and southern regions, were significant. The South's rapid growth and the issue of slavery made these discussions even more complex. A key contradiction involved counting slaves in population for representation, despite them being disenfranchised. The compromise counted 3 out of every 5 slaves, which, though unsatisfactory for the North, was a measure to preserve union. Perhaps the greatest challenge in drafting the Constitution was finding a way for 13 independent states to see themselves as a unified whole. Delegates' awareness of local interests and biases laid the groundwork for the Constitution to be seen not as a perfect document, but as a living framework adaptable over time. Established in 1789, this stronger, more advanced union marked a crucial starting point. When George Washington took the presidential oath, he felt deep concern for the nation's future. While nearly revered as a god, he knew the fate of republics throughout history. Washington sought to prevent the formation of political parties, fearing factionalism might divide the country. Given the diversity of traditions, beliefs, and habits, political parties were inevitable. The first major disagreement centered on financial matters, how to handle the debts accumulated during the Revolution. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton proposed assuming all national debt to support wealthy investors, effectively dividing society into the rich and indifferent majority. This revealed the deep-seated inequalities from the early republic. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison argued this was unfair for ordinary people. Ultimately, Hamilton's plan was adopted, and the National Bank was established. Tensions between Federalists and Republicans spilled into newspapers and even physical confrontations in Congress. Efforts to suppress Republicans, through measures like the Alien and Sedition Acts, threatened freedom of speech. Yet, the peaceful transition of power to Thomas Jefferson in 1800 demonstrated that the Republic could survive ideological disagreements. The motto of unity from diversity highlighted the importance of accommodating multiple perspectives. Jefferson was an optimist, envisioning the country as primarily agrarian. He believed the government's role should be to prevent harm among citizens, leaving most other affairs to the people. This philosophy required westward expansion. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 nearly doubled the United States territory, though the new lands were insecure due to 7 years of war, smallpox outbreaks, and Native American displacement. Lewis and Clark's expedition revealed the complex cultural landscape of the new nation. In the 1820s, during James Monroe's presidency, European visitors marveled at America's democratization. Ordinary Americans, unlike Europeans, did not strongly differentiate between rich and poor or educated and uneducated, reflecting the roots of equality of opportunity. Figures like Martin Van Buren advocated political parties as necessary for representing diverse interests. Andrew Jackson's presidency symbolized the rise of the people. Equality meant everyone should have the same chance for advancement. However, the greatest victims of expansion and democratization were Native Americans. Even in 1820, much of North America remained under Native control. Jackson's Indian Removal Act forced tribes east of the Mississippi to relocate to present-day Oklahoma. Some, like the Cherokee Nation, tried to use U.S. law for protection, but were forcibly removed by soldiers, a tragedy known as the Trail of Tears. From 1840 to 1860, America expanded westward from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Politics, religion, and reform movements surged. Cotton plantations grew, and slavery spread in the South. Horses introduced by the Spanish revolutionized buffalo hunting for Native Americans. Meanwhile, diseases spread via traders' blankets. Westward expansion opened new routes to Oregon and California. Thousands of settlers, especially women, faced grueling labor, preparing food, tending children, repairing clothes, and driving oxen. Slavery remained the nation's central contradiction. Jefferson initially described slavery as a threat to life and liberty in the Declaration's draft, but Congress removed this passage. During Jackson's era, white Americans sought greater equality, while African Americans faced harsher treatment. The expansion of cotton kingdoms entrenched slavery in the South. While northern states began abolishing slavery, it grew in the South and became institutionalized. The impact extended beyond slaves, affecting society at large. Slaves worked from dawn to midnight, faced whippings, and were denied marriage and education. Frederick Douglass challenged these restrictions by escaping north and learning to read. Even white Southerners without slaves supported the system, fearing freed blacks could become their equals. The North's climate was less suitable for cotton, yet northern mills processed southern cotton into yarn and textiles. Despite British restrictions on exporting machine plans, individuals like Samuel Slater brought the knowledge to America. Factory women worked 12-hour shifts, often freezing in the cold. Industrialization lowered ready-made clothing prices, improving millions of Americans' lives. After the Mexican-American War, disputes reignited over whether slavery and freedom could coexist in new territories. James Madison had warned during the Constitutional Convention that sectional disputes over slavery were the greatest threat to union. Temporary compromises, like the Missouri Compromise, provided only short-term solutions. Henry Box Brown and others escaped slavery by hiding in boxes, while the Underground Railroad, led by Harriet Tubman, became a symbol of hope. The South reacted violently. Congress passed the gag rules, banning petitions against slavery. The 1850 Compromise admitted California as free, while Utah and New Mexico could decide slavery by popular vote. The Fugitive Slave Act forced Northerners to capture runaway slaves, inflaming anti-slavery sentiment. The Kansas-Nebraska Act further reignited disputes. Violence in Congress, such as Charles Sumner being beaten by Andrew Butler's nephew, demonstrated deep divisions. Abraham Lincoln's 1858 statement, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," became a defining observation. Lincoln believed the nation could not exist partially free and partially enslaved. Lincoln's 1860 election marked the first time a candidate opposed to slavery's expansion became president. Southern states, led by South Carolina, seceded to form the Confederacy, leading to civil war. Lincoln initially attempted limited military engagement and offered peace, but the Confederacy's attack on Fort Sumter prompted him to mobilize 75,000 troops, drawing the South further into conflict. Lincoln's generals, such as General McDowell, were cautious, avoiding plundering Southern agricultural areas and freeing slaves. Republicans argued that emancipation was both ethical and strategically necessary to weaken the South. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, shifted the war's trajectory. Though initially limited to Confederate territory, news spread rapidly, and thousands of slaves claimed freedom themselves, pushing the Union to take bolder action. Slaves acted strategically, disseminating information, escaping when possible, and guiding Union forces. Confederate hopes were dashed at Gettysburg. Following this, Lincoln pushed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, through Congress. The Civil War cost 750,000 soldiers, 1.5 million horses, and $20 billion. Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1865 sought reconciliation without malice, aiming for lasting peace. His assassination by John Wilkes Booth on April 14, 1865, ended this vision. Reconstruction became a complex challenge. Andrew Johnson, his successor, allowed Southern states to restrict freedmen's rights, though Congress countered with the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection under the law. The South was divided into 5 military districts, granting voting and office-holding rights only to loyal whites and freedmen. Reconstruction fundamentally transformed Southern society. Landowners negotiated with workers over wages and hours, freedmen reunited families, built homes, and established their own churches and clergy. Northern teachers and missionaries founded schools and colleges. Freed African Americans gained civil presence, even walking freely on sidewalks, once the exclusive domain of whites. However, these changes were not permanent. Corruption, northern fatigue, and entrenched inequalities undermined Reconstruction. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence to regain control. The 1876 election marked the end of this period, demonstrating that Lincoln's warning that centuries of slavery could not be undone easily was accurate. Post-Civil War America underwent massive transformation. Rapidly expanding industries, from Caribbean sugar plantations to Virginia tobacco and Southern cotton, surpassed previous economic scales. Textile mills employing thousands grew into massive railroads and steelworks. Pittsburgh's Homestead Steelworks produced 200 tons of steel daily. Skyscrapers replaced church steeples. Industrial growth required innovative systems. Land acquisition, swamp drainage, and bridge construction reflected ambitious planning. Railroads faced issues due to non-standard track widths until, in 1886, workers standardized 21,000 kilometers of track in 36 hours. Federal intervention enabled a transcontinental railroad. Union Pacific and Central Pacific built tracks through the Sierra Nevada, facing avalanches, landslides, and explosions, with many workers perishing. Bodies often remained under snow until spring. By 1869, East-West rail connection demonstrated the feasibility of a continental republic. Time zone standardization followed in 1883. Industrial giants like Andrew Carnegie vertically integrated railroads and mines, alongside oil companies and banks, creating massive financial institutions. Life for ordinary Americans, however, remained arduous. Workers faced dangerous conditions, child labor, and gender pay disparities. A growing middle class moved into less physically demanding office jobs. Universities expanded programs in law, medicine, and engineering. Economic depressions, however, exposed vulnerabilities. Workers organized unions, such as the National Labor Union, advocating the 8-hour workday, but faced challenges due to differing interests and violence. Samuel Gomper's American Federation of Labor achieved success with practical goals like higher wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Cities expanded rapidly, with New York's chaotic streets captured by writers like Walt Whitman. Immigration from Ireland, Germany, and later China reshaped cities. Irish Catholics faced discrimination, highlighting challenges of integrating diversity into unity. Chicago developed modern sewer systems and water supply, and became a rail hub. Gustavus Swift's refrigerated cars enabled mass meat distribution. By the 1880s, European and Chinese immigrants enriched urban culture. Wealth disparities grew, the richest lived in palatial mansions, while the poorest squeezed into tiny tenements. America's domestic expansion also had global implications. Industrial and scientific advancements enabled unprecedented warfare capabilities. While Europeans pursued imperialism abroad, Americans initially focused on westward expansion. By the 20th century, some U.S. leaders began to embrace imperial ambitions. Following the Spanish-American War in 1898, the U.S. occupied territories like the Philippines, despite their independence claims, revealing contradictions. World War I began in the summer of 1914 when a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Austro-Hungarian Archduke. The war brought unprecedented destruction via machine guns, trenches, and poison gas. Teddy Roosevelt's old cavalry ideas were outdated in this modern warfare. President Wilson initially declared U.S. neutrality, believing the nation should avoid imperialist conflicts abroad, yet eventually entered the war. Wilson later proposed the 14 points and the League of Nations, though the U.S. Senate, controlled by Republicans, rejected it, showing the difficulty of implementing his ideals. The war's end foreshadowed that no conflict could fully prevent future clashes. The 1920s ushered in a new era. President Warren G. Harding sought normalcy. The 19th Amendment in 1920 granted women the vote, marking the culmination of decades of struggle. Women adopted shorter hair, simpler clothing, and gained more social freedom. Technological innovations transformed life, electric sewing machines and refrigerators became widespread. Jazz music and the Charleston reflected generational tensions. Mass culture emerged through cinema and radio, offering shared experiences. By 1926, 20,000 movie theaters existed nationwide. Henry Ford's assembly line revolutionized production, though labor conditions remained harsh. Automobile highways and stock market investments raised living standards, but the 1929 crash ended the prosperity abruptly. Millions lost money, jobs, and hope. Factories overproduced cars and appliances, while consumers could not purchase them. By 1932, 13 million Americans were unemployed. Bank failures and Dust Bowl conditions worsened the crisis. President Hoover's policies failed, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed office. Roosevelt, from a political family, overcame polio and had a proactive, innovative approach. On March 4, 1933, he reassured Americans that the only thing to fear was fear itself. His New Deal, during the first 100 days, revitalized banks, created jobs, built infrastructure, and transformed rural life. Regulatory reforms protected deposits and curbed risky investments. Roosevelt connected personally with citizens through radio fireside chats, leading to his re-election in 1936 and 3 subsequent terms. The Treaty of Versailles after World War I satisfied no one. Victorious nations and losers alike were discontent. Japan's invasion of Manchuria and Italy's annexation of Ethiopia heightened tensions. Democratic European nations hesitated to confront Hitler, constrained by fresh war memories. Roosevelt opposed U.S. isolationism, aiding Britain against German plans. However, on December 7, 1941, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor inevitably drew the U.S. into World War II, exemplifying the destructive potential of industrialized warfare. Hitler's armies ravaged Europe, committing the Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews. Stalin's Soviet Union resisted at Stalingrad. Allied forces in Africa pushed back Germans, and the war's 6-year devastation reshaped lives. In America, the war mobilized industry. After Roosevelt's death in 1945, Harry Truman authorized the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, hastening Japan's surrender. The U.S. could no longer isolate itself, global engagement was unavoidable. Economically, America emerged stronger. Military forces became the world's largest. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, despite 20 million deaths and destruction, remained powerful, establishing control over Eastern Europe. The two superpowers entered a 50-year Cold War, with Germany, Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba as flashpoints. Truman assumed responsibility with his "the buck stops here" plaque and implemented the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, preventing communist expansion. Atomic capabilities enhanced U.S. confidence, yet awareness of nuclear dangers also increased, especially after Hiroshima. In 1950, the Korean War marked the first hot conflict of the Cold War. Truman sent troops under UN auspices without declaring war. Chinese intervention forced American withdrawal. Truman's consideration of nuclear weapons alarmed European allies. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev secretly sent nuclear missiles to Cuba in response to U.S. missiles in Turkey. The crisis escalated until President Kennedy, after analyzing U-2 reconnaissance, imposed a naval quarantine to prevent a repeat of the Pearl Harbor scenario. Soviet ships faced a tense standoff. We confronted each other, and our rival blinked, yet the crisis was not over. Kennedy warned that a single missile could kill 600,000 people. The brinkmanship highlighted the fragility of global civilization in the nuclear age. Soviet ships were experiencing a major military triumph. We faced each other, and our opponent blinked. Yet the crisis was far from over. Kennedy's warning that a missile could kill 600,000 people, and the fact that two men sitting in different corners of the world could wield a power capable of ending civilization, was proof of immense madness. A secret agreement between Khrushchev and Kennedy resolved the crisis. U.S. missiles in Turkey were removed, and Kennedy gave assurance that Cuba would not be invaded. History often seems to revolve around people in high office. However, a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, 250,000 Americans came to Washington for unfinished business related to slavery and freedom, showing who the true writers of history were: ordinary people. In American history, the tension between slavery and freedom was a constant source of struggle. The Civil War was a bloody conflict that cost more American lives than all other U.S. wars combined. Yet even after slaves gained their freedom, discriminatory practices continued to divide society further. Blacks and whites were segregated in schools, hotels, hospitals, and even water fountains. In Alabama, it was illegal for whites to play checkers with blacks, showing just how absurd segregation had become. Under the separate but equal doctrine, a sharp color line was drawn during lynching incidents between blacks and whites. Courageous individuals like the Wellelt spoke out against these practices. Under the leadership of Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP argued that the separate but equal principle was flawed. Ultimately, in 1954, the Supreme Court in the Brown v. Board of Education case ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional. This decision made a clear statement that segregation was incompatible with equality, affecting students' minds and perceptions. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery bus boycott were critical events that triggered the civil rights movement. Following the path of Mahatma Gandhi, King advocated non-violent resistance. Empty buses caused the loss of over $30,000 in ticket revenues, putting transportation companies under pressure. The boycott, which lasted for weeks, revealed the determination of ordinary people. Leaders like Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, though not segregationists, were reluctant to take an active role in school or bus integration. However, during the actions against bus segregation in 1961, the violence faced by freedom advocates changed the situation. Beatings, kicks, attacks with iron rods, and bus burnings forced Kennedy to deploy federal police. Attorney General Robert Kennedy advised black leaders to fight for their voting rights. This strategy was based on the belief that voting booths were different from schools, and therefore whites would react less. Yet when SNCC students ventured deep into the South to encourage black farmers to vote, violence intensified. Bombings, attacks, and murders became widespread. Passive resistance actions in Birmingham, Alabama, became a turning point that drew national attention. Police Chief Bull Connor's attacks on children with dogs and high-pressure water shocked the world through press coverage, forcing Kennedy to act. He introduced comprehensive civil rights legislation to Congress. In August 1963, 250,000 Americans marched in Washington, with Martin Luther King delivering his "I Have a Dream" speech, marking the pinnacle of this struggle. The civil rights movement extended beyond legal rights. Issues such as the displacement of black citizens to rundown neighborhoods in northern cities and widespread unemployment came to the forefront. The struggles of Mexican Americans against discrimination, as seen in cases like Hernandez versus Texas, showed that different groups embraced the movement. Young people began questioning freedom by challenging university rules. The women's movement was also part of this broader effort. During World War II, women working away from home were dismissed after the war. Betty Friedan's book The Feminine Mystique highlighted the unhappiness of housewives, spreading the idea that women could do more than domestic chores. The belief that women should have equal rights with men challenged traditional gender roles and even language, such as terms like chairman. The 1964 Civil Rights Act also banned gender discrimination. Later, the 1965 Voting Rights Act prohibited literacy tests and other practices that prevented black citizens from voting. President Johnson's sweeping social reforms tackled poverty and provided support to needy public schools. Health security programs like Medicare and Medicaid provided safety for the elderly and the poor. This active government model, initiated by progressive thinkers, represented the pinnacle of these reforms. Meanwhile, another major conflict, the Vietnam War, was ongoing. U.S. military intervention in Vietnam deeply divided the country. War supporters feared the spread of communism, while opponents claimed America was supporting an authoritarian regime. The rise of the anti-war movement led President Johnson to decline re-election in 1968. With Richard Nixon's presidency, a shift toward conservatism began. Nixon took unusual measures like freezing prices and wages when oil prices rose. His visits to China and signing nuclear agreements with the Soviet Union aimed to reduce tensions with communist powers. However, expanding the war into Cambodia revealed contradictions in Nixon's policies. Ultimately, the U.S. had to withdraw from Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese government fell. Nixon also lost the presidency due to the Watergate scandal. With Ronald Reagan's presidency in the 1980s, the conservative movement gained momentum. Reagan argued, "Our problem is government itself," advocating tax cuts and spending reductions. While intended to stimulate the economy, critics claimed these measures negatively impacted the poor. Most notably, Reagan's increased defense budget further strained the already struggling Soviet economy. Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policies and arms control agreements led to the end of the Cold War. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, ending this 40-year-long period of tension. As a result of this long process, the United States became a country more closely connected with the rest of the world. Technological developments, like the Internet, strengthened these connections even further. Yet these links also brought new threats. American support for Mujahideen fighting in Afghanistan later paved the way for figures like Osama bin Laden, whose 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center were the largest assaults on American soil since Pearl Harbor. These attacks demonstrated how destructive terrorism could be in the hands of small and seemingly powerless groups. The deaths of citizens from over 50 countries highlighted that the impact of 9/11 was global, not just American. Immigration has remained an indispensable part of America's story. With the lifting of post-World War II restrictions, new immigrant groups from Asia, South America, and Europe flowed into the country. After Castro's revolution, Cubans came to Florida, and millions from Southeast Asia emigrated to the U.S. due to the Vietnam War. By 2010, more South Americans than African Americans were living in the United States. Barack Obama's family was a vivid example of these global connections and ethnic diversity. Rachel Carson's 1962 book Silent Spring symbolizes the beginning of the environmental movement. Carson argued that chemicals like DDT disrupted nature's delicate balance and that everything was interconnected. Despite attacks from the chemical industry and scientists, and while battling cancer herself, she persevered. Her work showed that pollution was no longer just a local issue, as emissions from factories, vehicle exhaust, and chemical waste posed a worldwide threat. Today, climate change is one of humanity's greatest challenges. Carbon dioxide released from coal plants and internal combustion engines is steadily heating our planet. Droughts, hurricanes, and rising sea levels are tangible indicators of this danger. How is history written? I asked this question at the beginning. We write history by living it as individuals, because we are all shaped by our past. The story of America is one of constant pursuit of ideals of freedom and equality, intertwined with the harsh realities that clash with those ideals. The slogan E pluribus unum serves as a bond holding together these opposing forces within the country.